A few weeks ago, I watched a man hold court at a private dinner. He was exactly what you'd expect. Authoritative, sharp, the kind of person whose word is final and whose protection is assumed. He was the point fix of the room, the pillar everyone else leaned on. But as the night wound down, I saw him sit across from a woman who wasn't trying to impress him or compete with him. She was simply still, solid. And in that moment, the pillar didn't just relax. He practically dissolved. He leaned in and told her with a voice full of almost religious intensity, "You're the only person who makes me feel like I can finally stop." To any passerby, it looked like the spark of a great romance. The powerful man finally finding the woman who gets him. He called it profound admiration. He called it an instant magnetic connection. But as I watched his expression, it didn't look like desire. It looked like the desperate relief of a marathon runner seeing the finish line. He wasn't looking at a partner. He was looking at a depository. He wasn't offering her his heart. He was handing her the keys to his exhaustion. What was happening wasn't a meeting of souls, but a psychic surrender. This man, saturated by the weight of his own authority, had identified this woman as someone strong enough to hold the fatigue he was no longer willing to carry. He was mislabeling his own internal collapse as attraction. This is a silent, contemporary phenomenon, the refuge function. It's a dynamic where high-status men, unable to find a space to drop their armor, use the language of romance to perform a total psychological displacement. They don't want to share a life. They want to find a place to fall without consequences. And for the woman on the receiving end, what feels like being chosen is often actually the beginning of a heavy, invisible debt, carrying a world that isn't hers to bear.
And that story, that observation, is really the perfect entry point for what we're going to get into today. That dynamic, that deep, desperate relief being mistaken for romantic attraction, that's the core of this deep dive.
It really is. So our mission today is to really unpack this. We're going to explore the psychological mechanism of what we're calling stability transfer, especially in these high-pressure, high-status male professionals.
And how that transfer turns what should be an intimate romantic connection into, well, a functional coping strategy for emotional exhaustion. It's a heavy topic.
It is. We're really looking at this intersection of, traditional gender roles, this incredible pressure from professional burnout, and how that all plays out inside our most intimate relationships.
The whole discussion really hinges on this core insight, doesn't it? What actually happens when a powerful man's desperate, unspoken need for relief gets completely mislabeled. It gets called desire.
Right. And in that moment, a partner, a human being, is transformed into an emotional landing strip, a function.
And to really understand how that can happen, we have to start at the structural level.
Yeah.
The whole dynamic is really built on this immense and usually unrecognized weight that society places on a certain kind of man.
The man who has to be the fixed point.
The man who has to be the fixed point.
Right.
The pillar. The one who is never, ever allowed to break.
Okay, so let's start there. Let's unpack this weight. It comes from something we hear about a lot in gender studies and sociology, hegemonic masculinity.
Right.
We know it's a term that describes the cultural ideas and practices that legitimize men's dominant position in society. But what does that really mean for the individual man, day in and day out? What's the price he has to pay to be in that high-status club?
Well, the price is a profound rigidity. It's often, frankly, a destructive rigidity. The best way to think about hegemonic masculinity isn't as a goal that you achieve, but more like a cultural operating system.
An operating system. I like that.
It is. And it requires the man to run a very specific set of high-power, high-demand programs at all times. And any failure to run those programs perfectly, well, it risks a total system-wide crash. Not just for him, but for everyone who depends on him.
So what are these programs? What are the non-negotiables that this operating system demands?
The norms are pretty unforgiving. First, there's stoicism, that deep, almost performative emotional restraint. Then you have absolute independence, the idea that you should never need help from anyone.
Never ask for directions on a metaphysical level.
Exactly. Then there's complete emotional control, perceived physical strength, a high tolerance for risk-taking, and of course the big one, relentless, visible achievement and success.
And these aren't just like external things he has to show people. They become internalized, right? They become who he thinks he has to be.
They're internalized behavioral mandates. And together, they create what is essentially an emotional prison. The walls are built out of success and status, but it's a prison nonetheless.
So if you're a CEO, a top surgeon, a major political figure, you're constantly being measured against this kind of cultural ideal. The strong, silent type.
Yeah.
The John Wayne or James Bond model, the man who is just eternally self-possessed.
Yes, but the problem is that ideal is a total fantasy. It's not a real, sustainable way for a human being to live. And the immense internal strain of trying to inhabit that fantasy, well, that's where the cracks begin to show.
And the training for this role, it starts so young.
It starts in the playground. I mean, we hear the cultural programming constantly. Boys don't cry, suck it up, man up.
These aren't just cliches, are they?
Not at all. They are incredibly powerful socialization tools. They immediately create this link in a young boy's mind. Vulnerability equals weakness. And weakness could cost you everything. Your respect, your social standing, your identity.
And there's a deep legacy to this. If you look back, historically or evolutionarily, these protector-provider roles made sense in a certain context. Emotional control was probably a necessary tool for maintaining authority and stability, especially in really chaotic, dangerous environments.
It was a survival mechanism, absolutely. But that historical necessity now clashes directly, and I mean violently, with modern relationship expectations.
Because what do we expect from a partner now?
We expect emotional fluency, we expect mutual sharing, we expect vulnerability to be a sign of trust, not weakness. So if a man has been socialized for 30, 40, maybe 50 years to believe that revealing a genuine emotion is like pulling the pin on his own grenade.
He's fundamentally unequipped for real intimacy.
His tools for connection have been systematically disabled, and they've been disabled by the very same culture that gave him his power and his status in the first place.
Which leads us to the internal cost of maintaining that status, the true weight of being the pillar. From the outside, power is impressive. It organizes the world. People defer to him. But internally, you're saying it's just utterly exhausting.
The exhaustion comes from having to be that constant fixed point. A man in a position of authority is expected to be the center of stability for everyone around him. He is constantly deciding, constantly protecting, constantly absorbing chaos.
From the workplace, from the market, from competitors.
From his own family, his own dependents. It's this continuous state of readiness, of absorbing tension without ever releasing it, that puts the psyche under this chronic, unformulated strain. It's a pressure that never gets a name.
It's like the mental equivalent of holding a really heavy weight straight out at arm's length all day long. You can do it for a little while, you can look strong, but eventually that muscle is just going to fail.
That's a perfect analogy. And because he's the pillar, he never gets permission from anyone, including himself, to put the weight down.
And when men consistently withhold their emotions, whether it's out of habit or a really legitimate fear that showing doubt will cost them their authority.
They never develop the internal architecture to process complex feelings on their own. They literally lack the emotional vocabulary. They don't have the practice of introspection. So the result isn't genuine emotional stability. It's an internal collapse just waiting for a safe place to land.
And that's the core paradox we're talking about. The more visible his responsibility, the higher his status, the more people who rely on him, the less he is ever permitted to show any of that invisible fatigue. He's a prisoner of his own success.
The irony is, it's truly tragic. And this invisible fatigue is almost always the direct precursor to chronic emotional burnout, which for these high-achieving men ties directly back to their professional identity.
We hear about burnout all the time, but the way it shows up differently across genders is so critical to this conversation. What have we learned about that?
Well, the research points to some really distinct manifestations, and they often follow traditional gender roles. For women, a major symptom of burnout is often depersonalization, a kind of decrease in empathy, a feeling of being disconnected from clients, patients, or colleagues.
Which is often linked to being in roles that demand a lot of emotional support or just the sheer volume of care work.
Precisely. But for men, especially men whose entire identity is fused with their professional success, the primary burnout symptom is this overwhelming emotional fatigue. It's rooted in a feeling of being completely besieged by work requests and the crushing weight of responsibility that comes with the provider role.
So if my entire self-worth, my entire identity rests on my ability to be the primary financial pillar, then any threat to that structure or any excessive demand on it doesn't just feel like stress. It feels like an existential crisis.
It feels like the world is ending, and that's what fuels the burnout. And this is the exact point where the intimate relationship steps in as a critical, almost therapeutic buffer.
A buffer.
A buffer. There's a fascinating study from HSE University that surveyed a large group of employees. They assessed their level of marital satisfaction and then cross-referenced that with their corresponding burnout symptoms.
And what did that study find about the the protective effect of marriage.
It showed a very, very strong inverse relationship. As the level of marital satisfaction went up, the risk of workplace burnout went way down. The relationship was serving as a functional escape valve for professional pressure.
Okay, that makes sense for anyone, really. A good relationship is a source of strength. But you said the key detail was the gender difference in that correlation.
Yes, this is the crucial point. That correlation was found to be significantly more pronounced in men.
Wow.
The researchers explain that because career success is so foundational to a man's identity and self-esteem, feeling profoundly supported in his private life becomes a non-negotiable factor in preventing burnout. For men who struggle to emotionally disconnect from the race, who are in this state of constant tension, the personal relationship becomes functional.
It's not just for love or companionship. It has a job to do.
Its job is to provide a crucial source of satisfaction, support, and stability that allows him to remain operational at work, to keep winning.
So for the high-status man we're describing, the relationship isn't just an enjoyable complement to his life. It is a fundamental, functional necessity for preventing career failure. It's an external stabilization mechanism that lets the pillar keep standing.
And the data points to an even deeper feedback loop. Men who experience greater professional success also tend to report higher levels of satisfaction in their personal relationships. That connection was not mirrored in the data for women.
What does that suggest?
It suggests a direct functional relationship. The more success he has, the more pressure he's under, the more he needs that buffer. The stronger the buffer, the supportive relationship, the more fuel he has to go out and achieve more success.
So the relationship becomes less about mutual fulfillment and more about sustaining the man's professional output.
It's a very practical, almost invisible transaction, masked by the language of love and commitment. And if the exhaustion gets to be so great, and the man has no internal way to process it, he has no choice but to find an external mechanism to deposit that weight.
Which brings us directly to the core of this, the mechanism of psychic surrender.
Right. If the pillar is cracking from the inside, all that fatigue, all that pressure, it has to go somewhere. And what we see is a phenomenon of psychological displacement.
So the suppressed emotional fatigue, that constant unnamed tension from carrying the world, it doesn't just disappear.
Yeah.
It transforms itself.
It displaces itself as an intense, almost obsessive attraction or fascination for a particular person.
So he can't say, I am shattered and I need to stop being the fixed point for a while. That's not in his vocabulary.
It's unthinkable. So instead, he reaches for the nearest socially acceptable language for an intense, overwhelming feeling, which is, of course, the language of romance. He says, I am so drawn to you, or I am completely captivated by you.
So attraction becomes a functional language of substitution.
It's dense, it's solemn. It's not usually about simple physical connection, not in a lighthearted way. It's about a profound, desperate need for relief. The actual goal is not sharing a life. The goal is total surrender.
Finding a psychological configuration of stability.
Yes, onto which he can safely deposit all of his accumulated professional and emotional fatigue.
It's like he's a city's power grid that's on the verge of a total brownout. He's overloaded, sparks are flying, and he finds this massive external battery pack that he can just plug himself into.
That analogy is highly accurate for understanding this refuge function. He isn't engaging with the battery pack. He's not interested in how it works. He's just using its infrastructure to keep his own system from crashing.
And the partner he chooses for this role is selected very specifically.
She's selected based on her perceived capacity to be that external battery. He isn't looking for someone who mirrors his chaos or understands his struggle. He needs someone who embodies its absolute opposite.
So what are the specific traits he's unconsciously scanning for in the partner he identifies for this?
Yeah.
This psychic surrender.
The sought-after presence has to meet some very specific and very non-reciprocal criteria. First, she must appear to not reclaim anything.
Meaning she doesn't demand his emotional energy in return.
Exactly. She can't be another demand on his system. Second, she must not depend on him emotionally, because otherwise she's just adding to his burden. Third, she must not seek to impress him. That would make her another competitive peer, another part of the race.
And the most critical one.
Most critically, she must not collapse under his symbolic weight. He needs to believe she is utterly, completely capable of holding up all on her own.
That's the transfer of stability. He's basically projecting onto this partner the very qualities he can no longer maintain in himself. continuity, coherence, emotional composure. He's borrowing her stillness to stop himself from shaking apart.
And the language he uses to describe this transfer is so revealing. It's almost never the language of conventional romance. It's the language of function.
He says things like he feels finally himself when he's with her.
Or that he can finally breathe. He calls her a refuge, a port, a safe harbor.
These are not words of a shared journey or mutual passion.
They're nautical terms. They are terms of profound, desperate relief. They are communicating, I am resting on you because I cannot float on my own anymore.
This becomes so much clearer when we look at the specific example you've brought, the case of Elias, the high-level hedge fund manager.
Right. So Elias's entire world was defined by extreme volatility, high-stakes gambling on the market, and just constant, unending tension. He had to be emotionally rigid. He was known as the Ice King on the trading floor.
And his partner, Elena, became what he called his
decompression chamber.
Decompression chamber. I mean, that's such a mechanical, functional term for a human being.
It is, and in a way, it's brutally honest. His professional life generated what he himself called toxic adrenaline. And when he was with Elena, he wasn't looking to connect, to share his day, or to solve mutual problems. He saw her as a void, a stable field where he could safely dump the psychological poison from his high-pressure job.
She was the place where he could finally stop performing strength.
Exactly. So he is in love with her functionality. He's in love with the fact that she provides a stable, calm, non-demanding space for his recovery. He doesn't actually see her own needs, her own personality, her own separate life. He sees the emotional infrastructure she provides for him.
That's the critical distinction, isn't it? His intimacy, his love, is operating purely as a coping strategy.
This relationship is a necessary component for keeping his professional persona intact. If Elena were to suddenly become needy or unstable or demanding herself,
he would see her as failing in her role.
He would perceive her as a broken tool.
Yeah.
And that intense, solemn attraction would likely just evaporate because its purpose would be gone.
And what facilitates this whole displacement, this ability to treat a person as a decompression chamber, is that it's often framed as intense admiration.
Admiration is the perfect psychological tool for this. It's perfect because it creates a vertical relationship. The man places the partner slightly above him on a pedestal. He might idealize her composure, her independence, her self-sufficiency.
Which, to the partner, must feel wonderful at first, to be admired for her strength. But he's using that admiration as a kind of protective shield, isn't he?
Absolutely. Placing her slightly out of reach functions as protection. It protects him from the risk of real, mutual, horizontal, face-to-face vulnerability. If she's elevated, she's untouchable in a certain way.
If he keeps her on a pedestal, he never has to risk entering the relationship as an equal, as an imperfect, tired human being. He doesn't have to fear her judgment or his own exposure.
The relationship stays suspended, abstract. He doesn't really enter a shared reality with her. He just leans on her. He relies on her as the structural support that keeps him upright.
And the relief he feels, that almost mystic illusion of rest, it's immediate, it's powerful. But the cost is transferred entirely to her.
She begins carrying a heavy, invisible charge that was never, ever hers to bear. When a relationship is defined by this kind of psychic surrender, the man isn't offering his presence. He is seeking a place to fall without having to accept the consequence of the impact.
And this mechanism, while providing this incredible relief for him, is simultaneously setting up the partner for a slow-motion emotional disaster.
Which brings us to the dark side of being the chosen one, the invisible debt.
The tragedy here is that the woman's stability and her independence, the very qualities that made her the perfect receptacle for this refuge function, become the mechanisms of her own depletion. Her internal composure is, in effect, commodified.
And this burden is so common that it's been institutionalized in a dynamic that sociologists call relational management.
This is such an important concept. This is the work women so often perform to manage their partner's emotional lives. Work that is almost never recognized as labor. It's just taken for granted as part of the wife or partner role.
We have to define it clearly because it is so much more insidious than just, planning a vacation or making sure dinner is on the table. It operates on a completely subliminal level.
So what does it actually involve?
It is profound psychological maintenance. Relational management involves constant vigilance. It's noticing subtle emotional needs without ever being told. It's preemptively decoding nonverbal cues, a sigh, a tense jaw. It's initiating the difficult, necessary conversations that the man is avoiding.
It's soothing his frustrations about work,
And critically, it's absorbing his bad day so that he can decompress. She becomes the container for his stress.
So the partner is expected to be a psychological detective, a diplomat, and a therapist, all rolled into one, but with absolutely no formal training or compensation.
That's it, exactly. And one researcher noted that men often expect this emotional attention to be provided automatically. They see it as something a loving partner just does. They don't recognize it as a constant, draining effort.
It assumes that the woman's natural state is to be emotionally available and structurally sound no matter what's going on in her own life.
Yes. And what happens when the woman who is completely exhausted by the sheer volume of this work tries to stop performing it?
The whole relationship gets destabilized.
It does, because the man perceives her withdrawal not as her own exhaustion, but as indifference or rejection. He never realized he was completely dependent on her active labor. Because he never had to articulate his need, it was just assumed she would provide the support. He can't understand why it's gone.
And the woman, meanwhile, is now forced to carry not only her own weight, but also the heavy silence created by his refusal to process his own feelings.
This is why, when a primary partner stops functioning as the refuge, we sometimes see men outsourcing that emotional care through emotional affairs or seeking validation from other women. It shows how deeply ingrained the expectation of constant, free-of-charge relational management is.
He doesn't realize he needs a therapist or better coping mechanisms.
He just perceives that his relational advice has stopped working.
Let's talk about the psychological and physical toll of this one-sided emotional investment, the emotional labor imbalance. If a man is silent, the woman has to constantly try to bridge that gap, and that effort is just devastating.
It is. Research from the Journal of Family Psychology found a really clear link. Women in relationships with emotionally distant men experienced significantly increased stress and decreased relationship satisfaction. That constant need to decode unexpressed feelings just drains your cognitive and emotional reserves.
It's like being given a final exam every single day you are never allowed to study for. You're constantly searching for the right answer in his silence, and you're always afraid of getting it wrong.
And over time, this asymmetrical emotional investment leads directly to emotional depletion and burnout. We see symptoms like persistent irritability, generalized fatigue, and emotional detachment. And this isn't just psychological, it's physical.
The body keeps the score. What do we know about the physical manifestations of this kind of chronic stress?
We see clear physiological markers. Women in these kinds of asymmetric dynamics often report chronically elevated cortisol levels, the body's primary stress hormone compared to women in mutually expressive relationships.
So her body is always in a state of low-grade fight or flight.
Constantly. And over the long term, this chronic emotional exhaustion shows up as physical ailments, things like persistent tension headaches, insomnia, a weakened immune system. In some cases, it can even mimic the symptoms of chronic fatigue syndrome.
To really grasp the scale of this invisible burden, we have to talk about the mental load, this hidden dimension of unpaid care work. It's invisible precisely because it's managerial. It's thinking work, not doing work.
The mental load is the executive oversight of the household and the family life. And we can break it down into two distinct but interconnected types of labor. And both are disproportionately borne by women, especially mothers.
Okay, let's start with the first one. Let's call it the managerial brain load, the organizational part.
The managerial brain load is the cognitive labor that's used to create, organize, and plan the continuity of life. So think about the mental capacity it takes to ensure a healthy, varied menu for the entire week before you even make the grocery list.
It's scheduling all the medical and dental appointments for every member of the family.
It's tracking school events, planning birthday parties 6 months in advance, and critically, acting as the primary repository of all institutional knowledge for the household. She's the family's hard drive.
And crucially, it also includes the labor of reminding the partner about the tasks that they were theoretically supposed to complete.
That reminder, labor is itself a draining task. It means the woman is responsible not just for her tasks, but for the oversight of his tasks too. It transforms her from a partner into a project manager.
And the second dimension of the mental load is the empathy load. This is the purely emotional labor.
This is managing feelings, caring, and worrying about the emotional temperature of the entire household.
What does that look like?
It's calming down upset children. It's dealing with the emotional fallout from a bad day at school. It's worrying about a child's social difficulties. It's anticipating a partner's emotional needs before they are ever expressed. It's just ensuring the general emotional comfort and relational harmony of everyone in the house.
And it requires this acute emotional intuition, which is incredibly draining, especially when you're also carrying the managerial brain load.
When we look at the statistics, the imbalance is just staggering. The UN reports that globally, women complete 4.2 hours per day of unpaid care work. Men complete 1.7 hours per day. That's a huge gap in the physical and domestic labor, but the cognitive gap is even more telling.
It is. A detailed study on the division of cognitive roles in heterosexual couples found that mothers were subject to more cognitive labor in 26 out of the 32 couples they examined. Mothers were the default system administrators, the chief planners and trackers.
And the cumulative effect of all this continuous emotional and cognitive work isn't just general stress. It leads to a very specific kind of collapse.
What's that?
It leads to poor self-esteem, cynicism, alienation, chronic stress, and ultimately maternal burnout. It's a specific syndrome characterized by chronic fatigue and detachment that is distinct from simple job-related exhaustion. It's the systemic failure of the woman's own system because she's been carrying a dual life.
And yet, the high-status man, the one who is exhausted and seeking a refuge, is looking for the exact traits that put her at risk for this. He wants her strength, her self-sufficiency.
Which brings us to this tragic paradox of what's been called the independent woman syndrome.
Okay, what is that?
The independent woman syndrome describes a woman who has built a life of hyper-reliance on herself, often as a necessary survival mechanism. Maybe she vowed to never be financially dependent, or she had to mask any perceived softness to survive and thrive in a male-dominated professional world.
Her internal mantra is always, you have to hold your own weight. Dependence is dangerous.
Exactly. So she appears successful, competent, and completely put together. She looks like a pillar herself, but she is very often running on fumes.
And she struggles to ask for help.
She struggles immensely to ask for help. She finds it difficult to receive genuine care or to rest, and she often avoids true intimacy for fear of losing control or having her vulnerability exploited. And this relentless self-sufficiency leads to what's called hyper-independence burnout, characterized by chronic fatigue and anxiety.
And here is the profound, devastating irony. The independence she's so carefully cultivated to protect herself becomes the very reason she is chosen as a depository.
Her strength isn't viewed as something to be cherished and supported. It's viewed as an infinite resource to be leaned on.
She becomes the casualty of her own armor. She's deemed strong enough to carry her partner's externalized fatigue, while at the same time, she's completely unable to admit that she herself is burning out from her own overwhelming load. She suffers alone.
Because the man only admires her verticality. He never asks what it costs her to remain standing.
And this tragedy, it's not just a personal one. It is structurally reinforced by our entire society. When we talk about the strong, silent type as a good thing, we are validating the man's refusal to develop emotional fluency.
And we're simultaneously punishing the woman for demanding reciprocity. Society romanticizes this strong, silent man who only needs his partner's stillness. And this places an unfair, unspoken expectation on the woman to compensate for his emotional silence, to provide all the missing relational glue.
And the moment she challenges this, the moment she refuses to shoulder the entire emotional load or demands that they process things together, what is she called?
She's labeled nagging or demanding or overly sensitive.
That cultural backlash makes it psychologically safer and frankly cheaper for a man to remain silent and rely on the refuge function.
The social cost of being seen as nagging is often far higher for the woman than the man's cost for being emotionally unavailable. It just reinforces the entire cycle.
We can see these structural pressures reflected even in high-status professions where both partners are successful. The imbalance still persists. Let's go back to that physician study, the one examining the work-life integration gap between male and female doctors.
This is such crucial data because it completely dispels the myth that just having a high professional status automatically frees you from these gendered burdens. The study found a measurable difference in domestic labor.
What were the numbers?
Male physicians reported spending a median of 16 total hours per week on household and childcare duties. Female physicians reported 25 hours per week.
That's a huge difference.
It is. And conversely, the male physicians reported that their spouses did significantly more of the household duties. So even at the highest level of professional achievement, the woman is still carrying substantially more of the physical and domestic weight.
But the truly shocking finding was the gap in satisfaction with their work-life integration?
Yes. Male physicians had significantly higher odds of being satisfied with their work-life integration than female physicians did. The researchers calculated something called an odds ratio, and it was 1.95.
Okay, we have to translate that statistic into human terms. What does that actually mean?
An odds ratio of 1.95 means that all else being equal, after you control for their age, their weekly work hours, and the time they spend on domestic duties, male physicians were nearly twice as likely to be satisfied with their work-life balance than female physicians were.
Wow, that is a massive structural advantage just hidden in the data.
And the research tried to figure out why that gap persisted, even when both partners reported that their spouses were equally supportive of their careers.
So it wasn't just about spousal support.
No. The gap is not fully explained by the frequency of support or even the visible time spent on domestic chores. It points to underlying structural biases within the institution of medicine itself.
Things like what?
Subtle microaggressions, cultural norms against women in medical leadership, and the reality that female physicians often spend more time on non-promotable tasks like extra patient care and detailed electronic health records. The work-life integration gap isn't just a domestic imbalance, it's an institutional one that demands the woman compensate structurally at work and at home.
So when you combine all of these pressures, the rigid masculine silence, the relentless professional culture, and the structural bias that places care labor on women, you end up with this profound lose-lose outcome for the intimate relationship.
It's a devastating arrangement for everyone involved, truly. The men suffer silently from their suppressed feelings, which we know is tied to increased rates of depression, anxiety, and even severe physical health issues like cardiovascular problems.
And the women burn out.
Women burn out emotionally and physically from chronic depletion. They feel unseen and functionally used.
And the ripple effect of this, it extends to the next generation.
Absolutely. Children in these households suffer because of the reduced maternal emotional availability that results from this chronic burnout. The woman might be physically present, but her capacity for deep emotional engagement is compromised. All her reserves are being spent just holding up the weight of the man's unexpressed exhaustion.
It's a sophisticated, private solution to a huge societal problem, and it ultimately damages the entire family.
So the only way out of this destructive dynamic, then, is what we might call refusing the refuge. For the woman, stepping out of that functional role can't just be an act of passive aggression. It has to be an act of profound lucidity.
It's the refusal to carry a world that isn't hers to bear.
The sources suggest that to cease being a relational device, the woman has to stop managing, stop decoding, and stop cushioning. She needs to reintroduce the real into the relationship.
What does the real look like in this context?
If the relationship has been sustained by projection, by symbolic surrender, by these suspended, abstract emotional exchanges, then the introduction of simple, concrete, mutual reality acts like a chemical developer in a dark room. It forces the abstract relationship to touch the ground.
So, a shared silence, instead of a silence that she feels she has to fill. A face-to-face encounter where his fatigue is acknowledged but not immediately absorbed by her.
Exactly. If the man was only seeking to deposit his fatigue, if he was really just seeking a solution, this sudden requirement for mutual, concrete reality will feel incredibly uncomfortable, maybe even threatening. He's being obliged to reclaim his own weight and to process his own internal collapse.
And that becomes the litmus test for the relationship's survival. Moving toward what you call shared verticality.
That is the ultimate aspiration. Shared verticality means that neither partner becomes the ground for the other to fall on. Each person remains standing, capable of holding their own contradictions and their own fatigue side by side.
The man who is truly seeking an equal, a partner to walk with.
He will acknowledge the change and remain. But the man who is only seeking a landing site, a solution to fall upon, he will often retreat because the refuge function has disappeared.
So our deep dive into this idea of psychic surrender has really illuminated how the refuge function acts as this private, very sophisticated coping mechanism that high-status men deploy. It's a solution for them to the structural problem caused by traditional masculine archetypes that systematically deny them healthy emotional outlets and vulnerability.
But the central deception is how intensely seductive this dynamic can be for the partner who is chosen specifically for her perceived stability. We have to re-emphasize the profound cost of the invisible debt. Accepting the role of refuge means accepting the burden of carrying displaced emotional charges that were never hers to bear, and perpetually mistaking being functionally needed for being genuinely chosen.
We've really uncovered the critical difference between true vulnerability and psychological dispossession. Vulnerability is sharing the weight while both partners remain standing. Dispossession is one person offloading their weight onto the other and then walking away lighter.
And that defines the nature of the bond. True freedom in a relationship lies in this idea of shared verticality, in choosing a link where each person remains autonomous and capable of self-possession, rather than one becoming the landing site for the other's collapse. The relationship is not a place where you fall, it is simply a place where you walk.